The only clear path that Andy Burnham has spelled out so far is a road back to the 1970s, when Britain went cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund pleading for a bailout because we'd run out of money. Middle classes are going to bear the brunt of this. They're going to be seen as the new broad shoulders who can carry more than the others. Well, to be fair to Andy Burnham, I think that his debut was quite impressive. He walked into Downing Street with considerable affability and aplomb and dignity, and he was wearing, to everyone's surprise, but not really, a proper suit and tie. And what he's promised is that he's going to tell us all his plans in the next few days. But then, of course, House of Parliament rises for the summer recess, and everybody's going home on holiday. Well, not many politicians can actually achieve this, and certainly his predecessor, Sir Keir Starmer, who was notoriously wooden and very poor in terms of oratory and public speaking, would have been able to manage much better in terms of popular appeal had he been able to achieve anything like what Andy Burnham delivered today. And just standing there and marshalling your thoughts, he made it look very easy. He looked as if he was comfortable. He had a smile on his face. He looked avuncular. He's the sort of person you might even think he would happily let run the country. But we now need to see how he plans to actually run the country. And all he's told us so far is that he's going to abolish rough sleeping, which I think everyone would welcome, and which he also promised in Manchester, but I'm not sure he delivered it. So far, we know nothing about the 10-year plan that he promised today. I think that he has sort of made an indication in the broadest possible terms that he wants everyone to be prosperous in every postcode, and basically it's apple pie and jam tomorrow. How he's going to achieve that, I mean, everybody wants that. How he's going to actually achieve it is another matter, and it's hard politics and hard grinding negotiation, not just with the Treasury, but with his own backbenchers, many of whom have very different ideas about how Britain should develop and grow, and how it should be governed by left-wing principles, and also the green issue of net zero. And the indication so far is that the only clear path that Andy Burnham has spelled out so far is a road back to the 1970s, when trade unions were powerful and when nationalized industries, of which there were many, were constantly on strike, and when Britain went cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund pleading for a bailout because we'd run out of money. Pretty much what we're heading for at the moment. We've got a huge £3 trillion national debt, and we're paying about 110 billion a year just servicing the interest rates on that debt, more than enough to pay for some of the urgently needed measures that this country needs for education, for defence, for the health service, and indeed for the welfare bill, which is adding to that debt mountain. He was dragged kicking and screaming, in effect, from Downing Street. Keir Starmer, I mean, to be fair to him, and that's a very difficult thing for me to be, was actually elected with a landslide majority only 2 years ago, almost exactly. And in that scenario, should have been entitled to serve a full term. He made a complete dog's dinner of the job from almost the moment he stepped into Downing Street. And everything that he did seemed to be followed by a U-turn, often at huge expense to the country and to the taxpayers. We saw one thing being promised and another thing suddenly being delivered or not being delivered at all. On welfare spending, he promised that he was going to trim back the two-child benefit, which is very expensive, and then, of course, collapsed under pressure from his backbenchers. And I think this is the problem that Andy Burnham faces now, because one of the measures that he's going to announce in the next day or so, next few days, is the decision to repudiate some, at least, of Ed Miliband's net zero energy prices policies, which have imposed on Britain and British industry, as well as British domestic consumers, the most expensive gas and electricity and oil in Europe. And as a result, we are seeing industries crashing or moving abroad, and nationalised industries, or what he will plan to nationalise, for instance, British Steel. The reason that British Steel is in so much trouble is because of the cost of the electricity that is used in vast quantities in steel making. And so, a lot of the problems that Labour is facing is pretty much either of its own creation or inherited from the Conservative Party, which was drifting further and further left. And I think that Labour under Burnham will drift even further left. Well, first of all, lower bus fares are very welcome, obviously, but they're not going to solve our problems. And nor is clearing the homeless off the streets of Britain. You need a lot of money to carry out the sort of reforms that a Prime Minister who's promising basically a 10-year revolution, handing more power back to the state, more power to locally elected mayors, tax-raising powers, that is, and every single experiment that I've witnessed in my 50 years covering national politics, every single experiment along this line has ended in failure one way or another, either financial or in terms of administration. It's very, very difficult to wrench power from one part of the country and put it somewhere else. And it needs an awful lot of money in the process of doing so. You cannot make a revolution without rolling the pitch, as they say, and rolling the pitch, preparing the ground, making those who will lose as a result of these measures not worse off than they were before, costs a lot of money, and we don't have any money. He's made a big deal of the fact that he was a successful mayor of Manchester, but even people who have held positions in that region themselves admit that the ground was already prepared for him by previous mayoral administrations and the civil servants who ran Manchester and Greater Manchester and that area generally. And so they did certain things which were quite painful at the time, and they are bearing fruit today. And that's what Andy Burnham has to do. He wants the fruit, but he's not prepared to take the pain or inflict the pain that is inevitable in anything of that sort without the money and resources to effectively smooth the path for these reforms. Middle classes are going to bear the brunt of this. They're going to be seen as the new broad shoulders who can carry more than the others. But the thing is that they're already paying a big price. They are already bearing a burden. Tax thresholds have not risen in line with inflation now for some years. And so more and more of those middle classes are suddenly being branded effectively upper classes in terms of tax. They're paying the higher rate of tax at a much lower proportion of their income than they were only a few years ago. And that hurts. And also interest rates are quite high, mortgages are costly, the cost of living is quite high, and people are feeling this very much so. One of the things that Andy Burnham did not touch on was the issue of immigration. Now, immigration isn't just a matter of the people and where they've come from. It's not a race issue. It's not an issue about the cultural issue of the origins of the people who come. It's also about numbers and the fact that an awful lot of them are coming to Britain as cheap labour. And while they're coming as cheap labour, we've got 9 million people on employment-related benefits, mostly young people, and that proportion is growing every day. So in order to deal with the problems facing Britain, he needs to get young people into work or back to work. In some cases, they haven't worked. So the 18 or 16 to 24-year-olds who are leaving school are almost invariably now, large numbers of them, going straight on to benefits and will remain there possibly for the rest of their lives. Now, the simple corollary is that if you import cheap labor forces out the opportunities to work for your own homegrown labor. And we're in a position already where these are real social problems which will grow and fester unless something drastic is done. And there is no indication whatsoever that Andy Burnham intends to grasp that nettle. His biggest weakness, I think, is that and I think this is genuine, it's not just his critics saying so, he does love to be loved. And This is one of the characteristics of Boris Johnson, and voters will perhaps remember where that led. You need to be tough. You need to make decisions, and you need to have the balls to stick with them. And that goes for making decisions which upset many of the people you've nurtured as friends and allies through your political life. And one of the things about Andy Burnham is that he is famously one for holding on to and cherishing his friendships. But somewhere along the line, you've got to just think about the voters who put you there and who will decide whether to put you there again next time round. And so there are very, very big decisions and no evidence whatsoever that Andy Burnham is going to take them or stick to them. And the other problem that I think we are seeing is that he has, because he's been elected without any general election or public support, only from his own MPs, not from anywhere outside, he has simply risen without trace, without a mandate. And if he announces plans in the next few days, Parliament is then going to rise for the summer holidays, and all of his MPs and all of the opposition MPs will be disappearing around the world for a sunshine holiday at a time when the momentum of a new Prime Minister, a new government effectively, needs to keep going. It hasn't got time to pause for holidays. I think they've already started. I think that we've seen a great outpouring on the hard left and even the soft left about the fact that Ed Miliband, he's the real messiah as far as the left is concerned, not Andy Burnham. Ed Miliband has carved out a role within the Labour Party, the Labour movement more widely, as the person who has and he is actually a very bright man, although I wouldn't trust him with a knife if he was standing behind me. And I think that they want him as the Chancellor. They don't want Shabana Mahmood. Shabana Mahmood is on, or claims to be on, the right of the party. They don't like what she's done as Home Secretary, for instance, on immigration, which has been reduced under her administration. They won't like, if she remains on track in that sense, some of the policies she will announce on things like, for instance, I don't know, the triple lock pension, welfare reform. There has to be money raised by other means than simply higher taxes. There has to be a reduction in public spending, and the only target for a reduction in public spending is the bloated welfare budget. And at the moment, everyone's shifting from work into benefit street. Andy Burnham started very well today, I think, and he deserves credit for the fact that he stood up there in front of the cameras and his people and did not pause or hesitate or repeat himself once in the course of a very slick presentation. That's the easy part, although it'd be very difficult for someone like me to do it, but nonetheless, for him, that comes fairly naturally. But what he's got to do now is deliver, and he has a very limited period of time. He has a Burnham bounce, which hasn't been that spectacular so far. And he needs to deliver very quickly. And if he does, and we start to see a genuine rise in his popularity ratings, then it's quite possible we'll see an early general election. But I suspect that it will not quite take off to that level. And then we've got Andy Burnham struggling like everybody else in that particular job, 7 of them in 10 years, to deliver a Britain where everyone prospers in every postcode.